Hey everyone, just a quick little community update before we get started today. We are hosting our first community Zoom session tomorrow evening, 8 p.m. Eastern, online. It'll be a chance for you guys to connect with us and other listeners in the community. Really just going to be an open, informal conversation to talk about whatever's on your mind, talk about the topics that we talk about on this podcast. We are growing this community and we want everyone to have a chance to connect with one another. So go to our Instagram where you can register on our link tree. So join if you want to talk, join if you just want to listen. There's no pressure to put your camera on. It really would be a good place to interact with the community members. So if you can't attend tomorrow, no worries. We're going to keep hosting more and more events, and eventually we're going to do in-person events, which I'm really, really excited for. So tomorrow, Wednesday, May 10th at 8 p.m. Eastern. Don't forget to register, and we're super excited to chat and talk to you guys then. Welcome back to Life Unpotted. Today we are joined by the Daily Victorian. So Victoria, I'll just start by saying I came across your videos on TikTok and truly was amazed by the depth of your soul searching that you shared with the internet. I really related to it, your spiritual journey, your humor, of course, your remarkable yoga skills. Truly incredible. I downloaded your yoga app and I started practicing. Sophie actually has too. And it's been really great. Part of why I love the yoga so much is because I feel like you have this strong embodiment of like not only healing, but also peeling back these layers of like what no longer serves us. And that's aligned with a lot of the stuff we talk about on this podcast. So I'm so happy that you decided to come on. I'm so happy that we have you here. And it's going to be a lot for us to chat about. But yeah, I'm so happy you're here.
I'm so happy to be here. I am a new listener of Life Unpotted, but I am going to be a long-time listener. I love it. I love what you guys have to say. I feel like we have a ton in common. So I'm really excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
A lot of what you talk about is like, what are we doing here? You know, what does that mean? And like, why does that matter? I think you also talk a lot about the meaning of life. You do a really good job of like referencing a lot of like historical texts, like spiritual texts, philosophical texts, which really caught my attention. But I would say Sophie and I, both of us have definitely had our own journey with these existential questions. So I think one of the first questions we can start off with is how would you say one should navigate these big existential questions, especially the one of why am I here?
Yeah, I think I'll start by saying when it comes to purpose, no one has the answer to that question, right? I was listening to Closer to Fine by the Indigo Girls right before this, and it's a song basically about just soul searching, or at least that's how I understand it, talking about their journey of just doing all these different things and all these rituals to try to figure out the meaning of it all. And the chorus of the song is, the less I seek my source for definitives, the closer I am to fine. That has always really resonated with me in the sense of that the more I can just surrender to the fact that I'm never going to figure out the answers to these questions, and they're still worth asking. And I think asking is a lot of what we're doing here. The more peace I can find with not having answers, right? So I have existed everywhere on the spectrum when it comes to what I think the answer to what we're doing here is. I've been an evangelical Christian. I have been, after I deconstructed my religion, I was in this very nihilistic place of life is absolutely meaningless and then you die. I've passed through kind of that absurdist, we're on a floating rock, let's just bask in the meaninglessness of it all and find happiness in the meaningless. And now I'm in a place of, I consider myself a spiritual person again. I do think we're doing something here. I think we are connected to each other. I don't pretend to have the answers. I choose to believe that there's a meaning and a deeper connectedness to what we're doing here. And I make that choice because I want to and because it feels good to me. And I think when it comes to questions about purpose and is there a God? What are we doing here? What's the purpose of life? There's an impulse to kind of dig for capital T truth. And I think there is no capital T truth. And at least for me, it has been really healing and helpful to take a little bit of a pragmatic approach to it in the sense of what's going to give my soul peace? If it's going to give my soul peace to believe we're doing something here, then maybe I just lean into that and I look for signs of purpose in the universe, and I let myself believe that. So that's where I am now in a nutshell. But I think I'm sure I'll continue to change throughout my life, and I think that's a good thing.
I think it's easy to ignore these thoughts altogether. So it sounds like you've had quite a journey with it, and it's not never been something that you have like ignored. It's always been very present in your life. So I think it's so interesting that you've always had kind of like a hand in it, whether it was, you know, this positive spiritual experience or this like, what are we doing here? This is not a positive experience. It's kind of scary. But either way, like you went into the deep end of both ends of it. And I think that that's the beauty of it. It's allowing ourselves to not, or I'd say it's allowing ourselves to like explore and be curious and find the answers of what you said, like what makes sense for us, because that's what's going to leave us and guide us back to this place of just being able to appreciate every moment. I think it can be confusing because it sounds so intense and we're starting the conversation off with this, but I think the point that we kind of want to get to by the end of this conversation is that like going into the depths of these ends of these spiritual questions, it can really help us just find the most peace and the most excitement and the most contentness with each moment, and recognize that each moment is so important because it's something that, you know, we're so lucky to have in the first place.
Totally. And I think that we are all going to confront these questions at some point, right? Because we're all most people are very afraid to die, and when you start reckoning with that, these questions are going to come up. So I think it's a question of, are you going to reckon with your purpose early in life when you have time to course correct, when you have time to move forward in a way that's in alignment with that purpose, or are you going to reckon with it at the end of your life when it's going to be colored with regret because you don't have time to reckon, you don't have time to change your behavior?
I think it's so interesting, like when we're talking about these complex topics that for me on my journey, I've always kind of had an interest in. Recently, they have peaked. I have gone more in depth, right? You make such a good point that like we're all going to have to, in theory, confront these topics at some point, right? I mean, if we're living on this earth in this unique, crazy experience, you would only think that we would spend our time contemplating our existence, trying to figure out how can I live my life to the fullest, right? And I guess a question I kind of want to ask you is like, you know, you pose two kind of theories there. Either you confront it now, when you can reckon with these thoughts, you can shift your path, you can shift your world to say, oh, okay, death is inevitable in whatever capacity that looks like. I know that my form here is going to shift at one point. So let me really live my life I want to live. On the other end of it, you know, on the other end of the spectrum of age, maybe that's something you confront later on, maybe it's something you never confront. So it's kind of like, what do you think helps people to wake up in their younger years, in their 20s, in their 30s, in their 40s, 50s, to kind of look inward and look at themselves so that they don't have to wait? Like, what maybe, I guess, if you want to talk about what the catalyst was for you, and what do you think how do you think we can help other people so that they can wake up and not have to wait until, in theory, it feels like it's too late?
Yeah, it's a good question. For me, and we were talking about this a little bit before we started recording, but I'm an attorney, and I spent my whole life really, I was always really academic. I was very, very focused on school growing up and went straight from undergraduate to law school, straight from law school to a large law firm. So I always had scarcity of time, and I was always living in this really frantic headspace of just trying to get the next task, whether it was a test or an assignment at my law firm or whatever. I was always so focused on very short term. And I find living in that place is very stunting to thinking about purpose and thinking about kind of fulfillment in the long term. And that's an unsatisfying answer, right? Because if you're in that place, chances are you can't just snap your fingers and get out of it. I think like a scarcity of time, or it could be a scarcity of other resources too. Like I think a lot about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is basically just this concept of that you're only really going to start digging at your soul existentially when your other basic needs are met, when you don't have a scarcity of security and you don't have a scarcity. And so in some ways, I think having the chance to think about purpose and course correct in this way, it feels like a huge privilege to me, honestly, because lots of people are just trying to get, to the next, maybe they need to pay a bill or their time is so constrained that they don't have, these questions don't come up until they're on their deathbed because they've never really had the mental headspace to prioritize them, to no fault of their own, right? And I lived in that space for a really long time. So I think a lot of it is like your circumstances, honestly. And then I think when you do actually have time, or you are actually like in a place where, so when I quit my law firm, I was thrown into spiritual and existential crisis, and I wasn't expecting it at all. But it was the first time I think I had ever been able to come up for air and had time to wonder about stuff like this. And I really realized I had just been kind of passively going along with ideas and stuff that weren't intrinsic to my soul. And so I think if you find yourself in that place, having the courage to not be avoidant about it. And I haven't always had that courage. I avoid things until I can't avoid them any longer. I'm the queen of avoidance. But the sooner you let yourself dive into these questions and get in the uncomfortable place of, especially thinking about purpose. A lot of us are handed ideas about what the purpose of life is, right? By way of organized religion or just by way of our upbringing. And it can be really scary to go from, I have an answer, to I don't have an answer anymore. But you have to do that. You have to jump off that ledge of wherever you are to arrive at whatever is going to actually satiate your soul versus what you were handed.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, what you say about walking off the ledge. Right, when you get to that place, like there's a place where you have the option, there's a place where you don't have the option. A lot of that is determined by your circumstance. And I can totally relate to that too, because I think when you are in that mindset, particularly of scarcity of time, of thinking, oh, I only have X, Y, and Z, or like you're not connected to yourself. You're very much in like a fight or flight state, I think is kind of a good way to describe it. Of course, you're not going to think about these higher needs of who am I and what can I do. And I often wonder, what got me started on this journey, even in those times when I was like in a fight or flight state. And Sophie and I have discussed this a little bit, but I think it's having the ability to connect with yourself, because I think that is kind of the first leg of getting to a place of deeper depth and meaning with your life. It's being able to see yourself and show up for yourself. And I think it's so easy, and a lot of people go through life, and I went through a large portion of my life where that just, it's not an option really, because you weren't either shown how to do that, you don't have the resources to do that. And I wonder how people can create that space for themselves, because that is really, I think, the most crucial part to getting, from my experience, to getting to a place where we're able to ask these larger questions that are going to take us to a place that is more fulfilling.
Yeah, that a lot of that resonates with me. And yeah, being able to see yourself clearly, right? And be honest about what you're seeing is so huge and transformational. And I find, Sophie and I were talking about this before, but wherever you can, if you can find one little space of your life where you can be honest with yourself, like we're all queer people here, and for a lot of people that's coming out, or it could be any number of things. I find that if you get one little hook in your soul of, I want to show up honestly, I want to show up the way I feel on the inside, that can start to have a tumbling effect of every area of your life. You start to really want to live in alignment with who you are. So you come out of the closet, and then you start having a faith evolution, and then you start realizing what you're doing with your time isn't in alignment with who you are and what you really want. So I guess I'd say if you can just find one little space where you have the courage to seek honesty with yourself and look at yourself closely and be honest about what you're seeing, I think that will take you a lot farther than that one specific thing.
How difficult it is to look at yourself. I mean, the pain that we can discover when we make the decision that I'm going to look at this, right? And I think it's interesting because, I'm sure we all have different backgrounds. We have different experiences, different upbringings, different parents, whatnot. And I think sometimes there is this idea that like trauma or life experiences, it only really matters when something really, really intense happens in your life, right? And I think what I've been realizing a lot is that I really think that being a human being is inherently traumatic. And I don't know if that's the right word. I want to be careful with that. I don't know if it's the right word. It's like no matter where you are in life, no matter what spectrum you are, we all have so much pain within us. And I love how Eckhart Tolle talks so much about the pain body and how our collective experiences throughout life cumulatively, whether that is something someone said to you when you're 15 or whether that was something how your parents treated you when you were 5, they shape the way we view the world. And I think it can be really, really, and I in my own experience have confronted the fact that it's really uncomfortable to look at yourself and say, this is my life. This is the truth of who I am. And then kind of getting the point of being like switching that dialogue to say, this is the truth of who I thought I was. This is the truth of who I thought this pain, these experiences made me. And I just think I just was want to touch on that, like how the recognizing, kind of validating that it really is one of the most painful things I think we can do in this life is to make the decision that we are going to be honest with ourselves, because we might not even realize that it is so easy to spend life kind of lying, kind of avoiding the truth because we don't know what's going to happen when we peel back the curtain. We don't know what we're going to find. I think in my experience, yes, you will find pain, but I think on the other side of pain, I can confidently say is always growth. And that has been something that has spearheaded a lot of where I'm at in life.
Sophie, I think what you just said, I think what that like kind of what like with what Victoria said, like a hook, something I just felt in response to what you said was you have to break this narrative. And sometimes that means you have to break the self-sabotage that has came with this narrative who you thought you were your entire life. And it's just easier to believe like, oh, I sounded stupid when I said that, or I'm not smart enough to get an A, or these like little narratives that have almost like created a level of comfort for us. It's something that I think it has to be broken. And I think that process of breaking it open, it doesn't just happen overnight. It's a long period of like getting comfortable with believing that you aren't these small narratives you've told yourself that you have who you are, or like the environment that you've been in has told you who you are. And I think breaking that is really is part of this experience of awakening or becoming more aware or more aligned with who we are, whatever you want to call it. I think really challenging. And it feel like that discomfort that comes up when you're like, oh, maybe I'm not stupid. Maybe maybe this is not true. I think starting to really question that and allow that discomfort to sit with yourself and allowing that to happen daily, like you stub your foot and like that anger comes up that I'm stupid. Who knows why that connection is there? But that's a real life experience. So I think instead of reacting to that anger or that whatever that pain is of that narrative that you think you are, I think just setting with it is such a huge breakthrough for allowing yourself to unlearn these narratives and operate in a totally different world of what you actually are and not what you've been told you are or have thought you always have been. And it's kind of a constant challenge too. Like it's like a muscle you flex, you get more comfortable with it, but it still comes up at times. And it's like you can, like the classic tale of you can feed the good wolf or you can feed the bad wolf, whichever one is the one that you feed. So I think that it's something you have to always be aware of and always be working on, but the beginning is always going to be the most painful, but it's what's going to also allow you to break free.
Totally. I think a lot about how I try to just not shame myself for feeling afraid and feeling out of my element when I'm trying to do something new or when I'm trying to look at myself a little bit more honestly in one way or another. Because I always think about how, in a Darwinian way, in a keeping ourselves alive way, it's in our interest to stay safe, stay where we are, keep doing what we're doing if it's keeping us out of danger, right? And we have that animalistic side to us. We want to be safe. But we're also not animals. What makes us different from animals is we want something out of this life. And if we don't push back on that impulse to stay safe, maybe we'll live a long life. We'll keep ourselves alive. We'll keep ourselves safe. But I don't think that leads to getting to the end of your life and feeling like you lived a purpose-driven life.
They're very different things. It's, I think, at the end of the day, like, you have to, like, ask yourself which one matters to me. And I think it's even getting to that place of being able to ask yourself those questions, because I always say you don't know what you don't know. I think any sort of exposure to anything might cause you to question how you've been living your life if that's all you know. And I always think that's what's so amazing about social media, is that everyone can have exposure to these incredible different ways of thinking. I mean, that's how, like, we met you, and we were so aligned in what we found or what we saw you were talking about, that you start to realize you're not so alone. That's the other part of it too, is that they can help accelerate these thoughts and these feelings that you're having. And I just think that's, like, there's a beauty to that. And it always comes back to community and connection and finding yourself in the right community that is going to help you question these things. And I think that is really what helps facilitate continued growth is that.
I totally agree. And I think that I couldn't say for sure, but it seems like there's an uptick in existential dread in the 21st century, right? Even though it's definitely always been around. And I think that one reason why that could be is because, not to sound like Karl Marx, but capitalism has it has a hyper-individualizing function to it, where it makes us really in our own lane. And you can think about it even in the sense of, like, internet aesthetics, like the visual aesthetics of classify yourself as this very specific type of human being. And I think that is very not productive to our well-being. And it's really all about community at the end of the day. And I think that a big reason why so many of us feel so disconnected and so lost is because we've really lost the concept of what it means to be in community with each other. And even thinking about purpose, we think about it in this very individual way, when I think purpose, probably not that there's any definitive of it, but it's a collective effort, right? And I think social media can both be really helpful to helping us see that. It can also be harmful. It's both at the same time.
I think it's interesting, like, on the note of capitalism, on the note, we're both lawyers, we've both gone through this. Like, you really kind of grow up in a very individualist approach. Like, we are taught to operate in a scarcity mindset. And I think that makes it hard. Like, I have really unlearned feeling competitive and jealous of other people, especially on social media, like recognizing that, like, we can all succeed, right? Like, we can all succeed. And I've had moments of feeling jealous of other people's podcasts who are in the same realm of mine. I really question it. I'm like, if I care about this goal, if I care about the mission of helping people wake up, why do I feel jealous from someone who's also trying to promote that mission? And I think jealousy is such an interesting one, because I think we think that in order for us to succeed, somebody else needs to not, someone else needs to lose. So, like, what has been your experience with kind of like unlearning that kind of like scarcity mindset, especially being a lawyer and going to going to law school, going to a big law firm? How have you worked to understand that we don't have to feel like we need to compete with other people, and that even though we live in a capitalistic world, that what really matters is our collective awakening that needs to happen together?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think the first thing for me is just normalizing it and trying to not shame myself when I do feel jealousy. Because I think there are contexts where jealousy makes perfect sense. And I think this is a time where the internet can be really helpful. Because you think about back in the day, before the internet, you live in a town and you make shoes and the person next door makes shoes. you are legitimately in competition with that person. There's a very finite amount of feet in the village and you're competing for them. So it makes sense to like feel jealous. But the great thing about the internet is like you have access and everyone has access to an audience of infinity, basically, you know? And so there's really, I like to ask myself the question of like, is this a legitimate scarcity moment or am I creating an illusion of scarcity? Because I find in the 21st century, a lot of the time, there's not really scarcity and there truly is room for everybody to succeed. And when that's the case, I find that I'm able to kind of, what I initially digest as jealousy, I can then redigest it as, oh, I feel inspired by that person. I'm seeing what they're doing. I feel inspired by it. And I'd like to do that too. And we can both do it, you know? So that has been really helpful for me. But I think feeling jealousy is normal. And I think, you know, again, not to just sound so political, but I think capitalism engenders jealousy intentionally, right? It's optimal for capitalism for us to feel in competition with each other, you know, especially in corporate America. And when we feel jealousy with our coworkers, we're more likely to work harder without being paid anymore because we just have our ego tied up in doing better than other people. And I don't think that's our fault. It's designed that way, right?
Well, I think it's so interesting on the topic of capitalism. I liked what you said in one of your videos along the lines of like the concept of discipline and how I get like in that whole like I really visualize that whole kind of journey of you going from being religious to then being like we're on a floating rock, nothing matters. And I think in that journey there is a place of being like, you know what? I don't want to work hard because I spent my life, capitalism wants us to work hard and I'm not going to do that. I really like what you said about how about instead of diet culture, instead of discipline, what if we took that back for ourselves? So I think those are really interesting because I think I've also struggled with too of like being like, well, I don't want to work really hard. And then being like, well, what if I redirected that for my own joy and the joy of others? Because I think when we unlearn that, there is this whole process of recognizing that just because discipline might be in certain circumstances not what we want doesn't mean that we can't really form a new relationship with discipline, with hard work, so that we are really, tapping into our joy and the joy of others.
Yes. So I totally had that journey where when I left my Big Law job, I went through this phase of anti-productivity, anti-work. And I remember this was maybe 2021, and that was a growing sentiment online. It was a lot of people during the pandemic feeling this way of, I don't want to work hard. I don't want to be a girl boss. I want to lay in a bed of moss. You know, there were a million different things. I just want to lay in the sun. That's what I want to do. And that really sounded good to me after you've been working so hard for years. But I think I did, with time, come to realize we don't just want to lay in the sun. We don't just want to lay in the sun. We are not a horse. You know, we want more. We want to connect with people. We want meaning. We want something out of this life. And I think that in order to live a fulfilling life, you have to be able to apply discipline, right? Because our impulses are just not always in our best interest. Our impulses will really drive us to be stagnant and just want us to stay doing whatever we're doing, whatever quick fix of dopamine we can get. That's what our impulses will tell us to do. That's not what's going to make us the most happy in the long run. And I think that collectively, a lot of us got so carried away with the self-care of it all and the anti-work of it all that we started characterizing things like, oh, let me just scroll TikTok for 12 hours on a Saturday. It's like, oh, this is self-care and I'm doing but that's not, nobody wants that. That's not how anybody wants to spend their Saturday, right? So learning to apply discipline, but towards my own joy, learning to apply discipline to things like making myself get outside on a day when maybe I would rather, impulsively, I would rather just be lying on the couch, scrolling TikTok or doing whatever. That sort of thing has really helped me find some joy where I was feeling really lost.
I want to go back to you bringing up Karl Marx because I took a philosophy class in high school, or not high school, in college, and we were studying a lot of the things he said. One thing stuck with me because that was a huge text, so what he wrote. But one thing, the Communist Manifesto. But the one thing that stuck with me was that like when we become disconnected from our work, like it's kind of the downfall of everything. Like they use, I think, factory workers as a prime example because like when you actually spend so many hours of your life disconnected from that thing that you were doing, it makes sense of what you're saying. Like you didn't want to just not, you didn't want to like be disciplined. You were kind of burnt out is what it sounded like. And the reality is that we want to be deeply connected to what we do every day. We want to be deeply immersed and have it give back to us. And I think that is kind of the larger sentiment that's happening right now, or maybe that's just my world. I'm not sure. But I think it's so interesting. And I really think that was a great point of like, take your discipline back for yourself, whatever that looks like in what other place. If even that means like having a glass of water before you have coffee in the mornings, it can mean like such a small scale and it can be also on such a large scale of figuring out how to give back to yourself and how to show up for yourself. And that will snowball into a much more fulfilling, purpose-driven life. So I think there's some good things came out of that book. I don't know if that's controversial to say, but I just think that when we are when we're connected to ourselves, it can't be something that we turn on and off. I think that's where you said like you don't always choose this existential crisis. It chooses you because of where you're at in your life. And sometimes you don't have a choice because once it's been turned on, once like this purpose in you has been turned on, you can't see things the same. So life becomes extremely more difficult in ways that it used to be easy. And I think that is a kind of the driving force of humanity, honestly. That is the driving force of change for the good, for the good of it. So I thought that was really fascinating and really hit home of take back your discipline, because that was something that I always thought was, going back to associating success with, grinding yourself down to the bone. So relearning and reframing that you can lift yourself up, you can take care of yourself, and that can also be like a deep success.
I love that. I think that that makes so much sense to me. I really love that. I realized I keep saying I don't want to sound like Karl Marx, and this mug has Karl Marx's face on it, and so please. But yeah, I agree. Karl Marx. Don't agree with everything, but I agree. One thing that really resonates with me from Karl Marx's work and applies to what you just said, I think, is Karl Marx was very big on the idea that when it comes to our society's values, like what we as a people prioritize morally, he believed that that is driven by the economic order as opposed to the other way around, meaning like we don't have this like intense work culture because we're this intrinsically hardworking people in the United States. It's the other way around. Our economic order, our systems related to how we're working engenders certain values in us. And so I think it's easy to miss how much our environment is shaping our answers to these big questions around purpose and what's important morally and what's important spiritually. Like it's so interconnected with the culture we live in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was listening to one of your podcasts on Soulgum, which I love that name. It's so catchy. This was kind of like a different take, but you were talking about like the difference of like the death that we all are going to face and how Eastern cultures versus Western cultures, how we see it so differently, and how a lot of the times it goes back to like how do we operate in this world. And Western cultures like don't think about it as much, they fear it more, whereas it's kind of a part of, I don't know, I don't want to say everyday life, but kind of part of, the conversation in more Eastern cultures. And that, goes back to it's your environment that helps shape the question or the answers to these huge existential questions. And I think, in America particularly, there's kind of a void there. It's kind of like the answer is to make money and to have financial success. I think if that was like one way to sum it up, like that would be it. And I think a lot of people are finding that leaves us feeling super empty and like you want more than that, and it's leading people to question it more deeply. And money is a great thing. It allows us to get more of what we want, but it can't be the solution for our purpose being here.
Totally. And I think that our jobs have an interest in us not being super connected with purpose, because if we were, we wouldn't be working 4 extra hours at the end of our workday just because we're jealous of our coworker or whatever. So I think, all those things are so interconnected. Like, something I'm very big on death awareness and death meditation. That's a big part of my meditation practice, is contemplating death. I know that sounds wild, but I really believe that if everyone did that, if everyone woke up in the morning and reflected on the fact that they're going to die, and reflected on the fact of how short life is and how short our time is with the people that we have in our lives that we love, we would spend our time so differently. And our whole society would look different.
Because that's the ultimate fear, right? Yeah. So it's like, we have anxiety that we're going to be late to work, or we have anxiety that we're going to miss our train, or like all of these little anxieties kind of lead back to like this big fear of death. And I don't think we're really aware of it, but the way you just said, if we really contemplated that in the mornings, more often than not, we might find ourselves being less fearful overall.
Yes, and just taking chances in spite of fear. I really believe that our core fear is death. There's different people would answer that question differently, right? But one take on sort of what our core driving fear is that I really love is, I don't know if you're familiar with Ernest Becker. I think it was like a sociologist in the 70s. He existed kind of during Freud's day. And during that time, the ethos of psychology was very much sexual repression was driving everything we did, because that's what Freud thought, right? That everything we did one way or another, it boiled down to sexual repression. And Ernest Becker, kind of in response to that idea, thought that our core repression was fear of death, and that everything we did, you can circle the drain back to fear of death, right? So you think about the choice whether to have children. You think about the urge we all feel to accumulate wealth and, material possessions. All of that can be thought of in the sense of we want to leave something behind. We're so afraid of being erased from the earth in a really permanent way. We want things that are going to outlast us when we're gone, because then maybe in a way we're still around. And that, but I don't think existence is so simple as to be able to be boiled down to one core thing, like a lot of people during the 70s would have said. But I think Ernest Becker was onto something with that. I think we are so afraid to die, and we are so afraid to be forgotten. And that really does color a lot of what we do. And I think when it comes to just spending our day in and day out doing non-fulfilling things, I think we're kind of repressing our awareness of our death. I find people either love to talk about death, because they're really in this space of trying to course correct and start living in alignment with their purpose. And so that question, even though it's a scary question, it informs their choices. Or people do not want to talk about that or think about that because they're trying to block it out.
It's so fascinating how something that is the only definite in life, that is something that we all avoid. And I have been even like on the podcast of like, oh, like I don't want to post a clip on Instagram about death because I don't want to be morbid. But then it's just kind of like exactly like you said. And I think it was so interesting, like thinking about the urge to have children, right? A lot of the reason I think why people do have children is because you want to feel like there is someone you are leaving behind who are going to carry on your genes or your last name or whatever that is. It's almost like we do so many things in life out of fear that we're going to keep doing to perpetuate keeping us alive, but that we end up missing the point, chasing and clinging to so many things simply to keep our ego going, simply to keep this idea that we've created about ourselves. And it's almost like comes to the point of like, we are so caught up in this idea of ourselves, like you're Victoria, I'm Sophie, Daisy, but who even is that, right? Who is
Yes.
Victoria? You could sit here, you could tell me about, oh, Victoria is the name my parents gave me. I had all these accomplishments, I had those things. But I think when we start to recognize that, like, who we are is nothing that comes external. Who we are is nothing that comes from the outside. It is completely within. And I think it's so interesting because when you do kind of have this more spiritual experiences where you are more connected to that in inner self, and you have mentioned experience with God and with religion, and I'd like to hear about that as well, but I don't think you feel as scared anymore. And
Yes.
so why don't you tell us about, you had this video which I absolutely love where you're talking all back and forth about feel like you weren't scared of death anymore. So what was the experience like for you to come to a point where you felt, whether it was a moment or not, that you weren't as scared of dying as you once were before?
Sure. So a couple things came up. I'll respond and then I'll answer that question. So on the topic of having kids, I just wanted to say, I don't know if you guys like bad reality TV. I love it. I love like Love Island and all of those. And something that's really fascinating to me when I watch those TV shows, everybody on those shows wants to have children. They all want a big family. That is all of, a lot of the time, everyone on the island, if you did not want to have children, you would be the pariah of the island and nobody would want to date you because they're all looking for, they want a big family. And it's funny because I find a lot of the time when in those interviews they're asked about why they want to have children, it's something to the effect of, I want to create a mini me, especially the men on those shows. I want to teach them to play the sport I play. And it really does make me think about death and how we really just have this deep fear of being gone to the point where when we think about having children, a lot of what people think about is like wanting to reproduce their own qualities. That's not at all to say there aren't good reasons to want to have children. I think there are a lot of good reasons to want to have children, love children anyway. But yeah, I think that's a super interesting thing. And I think it colors so much of what we do and so many big, huge choices we make on not being as afraid of death anymore. So I had a spiritual breakthrough. As silly as that sounds, I still don't know how to talk about it, in March of last year. And I was in a place at that time where I was actively deconstructing my faith. I was not because I wanted to, but because it was bubbling out of me involuntarily. I was really losing an ability to run from the truth that I felt inside myself, that knew that I was not aligned with sort of the faith model I was trying to keep myself in. And I was really in a place of crisis. I went up to this cabin for the weekend, a getaway house, and I have this tiny little tiny car. I'm terrified of driving. And I was driving up there and I almost got in an accident. I turned a corner and I almost hit an 18-wheeler. And I was already just actively I was already actively kind of having a spirally week. That really got me going, almost having that accident, to the point where the rest of the ride up there, I was just visualizing myself hitting that 18-wheeler again and again, really just having a panic situation around that. And I get there, start reading Karma by Sadhguru. I think it was Karma. It could have been Inner Engineering. Started reading something by Sadhguru, and he said something in the book that said, no matter where you're going, no matter what you're doing, you're just walking to your grave, which horrified me. Obviously, I hated that. And so I'm lying in that cabin trying to sleep, no service, no way to calm myself down, and I really just spiraled for hours. Got up the next morning, happy to be at this cabin, not thinking about it, having a good time, and had the craziest spiritual breakthrough. Only time in my life I've had an experience like that. It's really hard for me to explain because I think that anything I could say about it would sound really trite. It was things I'd read before a million times. but I experienced it. I really had this experience of the fact that I am not all these identities that I think I am. Just like you were saying, Sophie, my name, my career, my everything about me, it's not who I am. And those things will die. My identity, my brain will die. But what I am really, intrinsically, is alive in so many other places beyond me. It's alive in everything. And so the fact of my one identity, my human personhood dying, just in that moment, it became so much less scary to me because I really felt the extent to which I was just one small piece in a way, way bigger thing that will keep going when I'm gone. And that experience lasted for maybe 2 hours. And I came out of it and I was just like speechless. I never expected something like that to happen to me. I was totally sober. I was not like going there looking for an experience like that. So it was just really shocking. And I think in the period after it happened, I kind of intellectualized it. And of course, I went straight to TikTok, posting about it on TikTok, as I do, and heard a bunch of feedback about what it was. You're in psychosis. You were probably drugged, all these different things. And that got me thinking of, well, did I have a spiritual breakthrough? Or did I have a stroke? Like what was that? But I have since decided I want to believe that the experience that I had and what I learned from it was true. And so I'm going to, right? There are many ways to explain anything. There are lots of alternate explanations for what could have happened, but I choose to believe that I had a brief connection with God and that I was able to see things clearly in a way that I'm not able to most of the time. And that experience has changed my life. I've never had another, it hasn't happened since. It had never happened before. But just knowing that that happened has really, really helped me. And I've had a totally different relationship with death ever since that happened.
It's so interesting when we have these experiences that don't really match up with any of the words we've been taught, right? We think about the English language, we think about what we've learned in terms of concepts, in terms of ideas, and sometimes it's impossible to explain these kind of spiritual experiences we have because they transcend beyond the concepts we are identified with our whole life. They are not something that we can explain, and because it's rather a feeling, it's rather an experience. And I think, of course, naturally, it's like, oh, did I have a stroke? And when you have not left your form, when you have not left this identity, when you are living in so much duality and division of I'm in a world, we are separate. Of course, you can't conceptualize the idea that no, maybe we are actually all one. Maybe we are all connected. Something that seemingly sounds so crazy when in reality it actually makes a lot of sense. So I think that number one, that's amazing that you had that experience, and I've had something similar, different different conditions we were on a retreat and whatnot, but it almost doesn't matter what it means, and it almost doesn't
Yes.
matter if you can explain it. I think all that matters is that you had that experience, and other people could take what they want from it, because I just think ultimately some experiences transcend words, and we always want explanation, right? We always want something to be explained. We seek the truth for so long that we end up suffering because we can never really find the answer that we ever want. There never will be a perfect answer to the questions we ask. And sometimes the answer is an experience that is not one that we can explain. So I just think that that is so powerful. And I think it's something that's so important to talk about because it's so easy to judge an experience like that. But that judgment is really rooted in fear. Because I think a lot of people, when we haven't kind of let go fully. It's hard to understand that there's something more than who we thought we are. So thanks for sharing that. I think that's really incredible.
So I was gonna relate back. I mean, that experience sounds incredible, and that was the first video of you I ever saw, and I was like, "Whoa, this is so relatable." And my experience was a little bit different. Sophie and I had gone, like she mentioned, on a retreat, so it was a week long of just unpacking these ideas, conceptual ideas of who we are, what is this, really the scary stuff, and we took mushrooms. So like that was an experience of like kind of like letting go a little bit. And we didn't even like take that many, but it was enough to like recognize that there is something, well, recognizing like the pain and the concepts and the things I've always attached myself to. It's all words, but it's being able to connect with yourself on a certain level. And what I experienced was like months after that, for months after that, it kind of like put me on the other end where I was like, I was so fearful. I was clinging on to things so much. And it wasn't until I think like 4 months after, like I was having like a lot of anxiety because I was like really fearful of the experiences that I'd had.
Mm.
And it wasn't until 4 months later of like kind of like being in that purgatory of like experiencing these like dreadful things that I wasn't willing to accept. It wasn't until like 4 months later where I was like, okay, I accept this. And now I don't resist like hardly anything. Like, not to say I don't resist things, I certainly do, but like the bigger, scarier things, I have a different insight on it where I'm like, you're going to be okay. Okay. So I just wanted to relate that back because such an interesting experience, but I get what you mean. Like, it's not something you can verbally explain to the fullest extent to justify it.
Right. And at the end of the day, experiences are subjective, and how an experience was received by me, it may have been received super differently by someone else. And I kind of think when it comes to purpose, the purpose of it all, the meaning of your experiences is whatever helps you sleep at night. You know, I choose to believe in the deeper connectedness of it all. That's what felt true to me. And that's also what sits well with my soul. And so that's where I am. But others, you know, there are people who find a lot of peace in the nothingness, in believing in the nothingness, in believing we're really just on a floating rock. You're just a random creature on a floating rock. There is no point. That's a super freeing mindset to some people. And I think that there's no wrong answer. There's no wrong answer. And for me, I do think that when we have experiences like that, they're somewhat colored by what we want to believe. You know, you had this experience and you received it in this spiritual way because you were searching for that. You were in spiritual crisis. I've heard that feedback a lot. That very well may be true, and I'm okay with that. I was searching, and I found what I was searching for, and that's satisfying enough for me. You know, I don't pretend that any experience I've ever had is like irrefutably connected to something deeper, but it felt that way to me, and it makes me happy to think that it was, so I'll take it.
Like, on the note of the transformation that you had growing up religious, where did this experience kind of tie into that? Did it, in concept, did it feel different than all the things you've thought when you were really religious? I know we haven't really talked about this,
Yeah,
so if you're open to it, would really be interested in hearing kind of like that briefly, like that religion, that like transformation of deconstruction from being really religious and the difference
sure.
of that to where you kind of stand now in the spiritual world. Because I think sometimes religion, of course, is spiritual, but there's so many ties to religion also. So I want to hear what you think about that.
Sure. So I grew up in the Southern Baptist Church, so I grew up Christian. My idea of God was Judeo Christian, capital G, he, him pronouns, God, right? And I think my interest in my religion, I've always been very focused on it. And I think that was because I've had a deep fear of death since I was a little child. And I was very consumed by the concepts of eternity and heaven and hell. And especially, I've known I was queer since I was a small child. And so kind of messaging around homosexuality really scared me. And so I had a lot of fear related to eternity growing up. And, you know, the idea of mutual exclusivity when it comes to religion, which isn't just a thing with Christianity, many religions follow a model like that, where it's our people who belong to our faith have this outcome in eternity and others have a bad outcome. That has never sat right with my soul. I've always, since I was a little kid, I remember just asking questions around that. What about good people who are in a different part of the world? And, it never really, there were a lot of things about it where I just kind of couldn't pull the thread. I could not pull the thread, or I would find myself at a place where it was very bare and transparent that it didn't sit right with me. And so as I was coming out in my mid-20s, that sort of sent me into faith crisis, right? And I had already changed so many things up about my beliefs. I was very much a picker and chooser at that point, where anything that didn't align with how I felt, I was kind of, very much making my faith my own. But I got to a point in my mid-20s where I was like, I'm really just making this up as I go. And if I've gotten to the point where my beliefs are not at all tied to the Bible, they're not at all tied to anything beyond what feels true to me, how can I, in good faith, say I'm doing the same thing I was before? I just came to a point where it's like, you're changing so much at this point, you really just need to figure out what you're doing. And that's kind of where I was around that time of the spiritual breakthrough. And now my ideas around God are really different. I don't know, but I don't believe God is a anthropomorphized being in the sky. I don't believe that. What God is to me is just the collective aliveness that is in all of us. And that's very informed by my yoga practice and very informed by Hinduism, because, yoga is a Hindu practice, and kind of the concepts of divinity, sort of the idea that God is in all of us, God is in animals, God's in every living thing. God is a collective force. That's sort of how I think about divinity now, with the big caveat that I do not claim to know or have an answer. That's just what intrinsically feels true to me.
Thank you for sharing that, Victoria. That was, it's so helpful to hear of someone's journey because it's so personal, and it's so interesting to hear because I didn't grow up religious at all, so I don't know what that looks like. Like this newfound interest in spirituality for me, it's somewhat new, and I really like what you tied it back to is this, what you see it as now is like this collective aliveness that's in all of us. Because I really relate to that, and you said it's really informed by like your yoga practice, and I think that I think at the core of it, yoga is like connecting with yourself, and it's connecting with, and if you want to say it like that, connecting with the collective aliveness of everyone. And what's more powerful than that? I think like, I agree. Like, I think like whatever God there is, like it's power in numbers and power in being aware that we are all collectively attached and we all have this collective aliveness within us. Like nothing is more powerful than that. I don't think there is, because we are the ones who are aware of all of this. So why wouldn't the power be within all of us collectively being aware of that?
Yes. And I really believe that model of God makes us treat each other better, right? Because what is more motivating to treat the world well, treat each other well, than an understanding that we're all the same thing, and we're all something holy. Like that, buying into that feels true to me, but it also drives me to care more about the world, and also to hold myself in a higher regard, but also just, really want to love people well and do right by every living thing. best I can.
We start to develop a sense that, we really are all connected, and the walls of separation that have existed throughout time of wars and division and religion and sexuality and racism and just like everything that we could possibly do to separate ourselves. And I've learned a lot about that being the fact that what is the ego in us wanting to feel unique, wanting us to feel different. And it's not that we still can't feel that way when we do choose to recognize that we do have collective interest in this world too. We are all here together. And I think if there's anything that we hope to do with this podcast is to, number one, reinforce the idea of how important it is to connect with ourselves. But remember, it doesn't stop after there, right? It's connecting with everyone else, because the more that we can validate and share our journeys, and you can share your experience and I can share my experience, the more other people will see that, and the more that other people will realize, oh wait, I'm not alone. I don't have to go through this by myself, because this is not something that is just unique to me. There's nothing wrong with me. This doesn't mean anything bad about me. This is just a collective experience. So I think, just to tie up the whole conversation, I think when we can let go of the walls and the barriers that we have held on to our whole life and that exist in society and that are prevalent in so many of our structures, we really can reach a level that is so much deeper than words, that is so much deeper than something we can comprehend. And I think there's so much beauty in that. And I think that is why I'm here. That is why I am doing this podcast. That is why, this conversation has been so amazing with you, because you are vulnerable, right? You are sharing your truth, and that's hard, but it's powerful and it's moving, and the dominoes start to fall, and other people will start to wake up because they see that it's possible. So I just wanted to say thank you for your vulnerability on just generally, because it goes a long way. Sharing your truth, sharing yourself, sharing where you are in life, figuring out where you are, navigating everything from religion to career. And it's been an awesome time chatting. And I definitely think that this was just such an inspiring conversation on so many levels.
Thank you so much for saying that. I hats off to y'all for your vulnerability. You guys are talking about big, scary things on this podcast, and I really think it's worthwhile. Just like you said, all this soul searching, it really helps us approach the rest of the world in a more compassionate way, and that's super important. So, yeah, thank you so much for having me. I loved talking to y'all.
Thank you so much, Victoria.